What would you do if someone called the police on you for simply walking into your own home? When Margaret Simmons sees a black man entering a house in her neighborhood, she immediately assumes the worst. But the shocking truth waiting behind that door will leave her speechless. Who is Jonathan Hayes, and why does he have more power over Lakeshore Estates than she ever imagined? Watch the full story on H2 Black Thread. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Margaret Simmons had always considered Lakeshore Estates to be more than just a neighborhood. It was her neighborhood. She had lived there for over a decade, and in her mind, that gave her a sense of ownership over the community. She knew the rhythms of the street, the schedules of her neighbors, and the type of people who were supposed to live there. She took pride in keeping an eye on things. Not in a nosy way, she would insist, but in a concerned citizen way. If an unfamiliar car was parked too long on the curb, Margaret noticed. If the teenager down the block started playing music too loud, Margaret would send a polite but firm email to the homeowners association. If the new family on Willow Lane didn't mow their lawn for a few weeks, she was only looking out for the community when she called to gently remind them about neighborhood standards. It was her duty. And so, on that fateful Tuesday morning when she saw him, Margaret knew something wasn't right. Her morning had started off just like any other. She had taken her usual walk around the neighborhood, a travel mug filled with lukewarm coffee in one hand, her phone in the other. The air was crisp, the sun casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns and pristine driveways. She liked this time of day. It was quiet, predictable, the kind of peacefulness that only existed in places where people like her lived. But then, she saw someone, that shattered that sense of predictability. A black man, tall, well-dressed, confident. He stepped out of a sleek black Mercedes, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. The car itself was pristine, expensive, the kind of vehicle that didn't belong unless it was being driven by a resident. Margaret frowned, slowing her steps as she watched him from across the street. She had never seen him before, and in a neighborhood like Lakeshore Estates, not knowing someone meant they didn't belong. Her eyes tracked his movements as he walked toward the Harper house. No, that wasn't possible. The Harper house had been on the market for months. A stunning colonial-style home with a grand wraparound porch, tall white columns, and massive bay windows. One of the most expensive homes in the neighborhood, but as far as Margaret knew, no one had bought it yet. And yet, this man walked up the driveway, climbed the front steps, and, without hesitation, reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. A key. She stopped walking altogether, gripping her coffee mug so tightly that the lid nearly popped off. Her mind raced. There was no way. No way he had a right to be there. Could he be a real estate agent? No, he wasn't carrying paperwork or a clipboard. A contractor? No, he was too well dressed, a friend of the owner's. No one lived there yet. There was only one explanation. He was breaking in. Of course, that had to be it. It didn't matter that he had a key. Anyone could get a key if they wanted to. It didn't matter that he wasn't sneaking around or trying to force the door open. Criminals were smart these days. Margaret's heart pounded. Her fingers scrambled for her phone, nearly dropping it as she unlocked the screen. She had called 911 before. Never for anything too serious, of course. Maybe a suspicious van that turned out to be a delivery service or kids skateboarding too close to parked cars. She had a responsibility to report things, to maintain order. But this was different. The emergency dial pad was second nature to her. She pressed the numbers. The line rang once before a calm female voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? Margaret took a breath, her eyes locked onto the house. She could still see him inside, moving around like he owned the place. She lowered her voice as if he could somehow hear her through the phone. Yes, hello, I'm calling from Lakeshore Estates. There's a suspicious individual attempting to break into a home on Maplewood Drive. Her voice was steady, confident. Can you describe the individual, ma'am? Margaret barely hesitated. Yes. He's black, well-dressed, but I know he doesn't belong here. I saw him let himself into the house, but I know for a fact no one has moved in yet. Please send someone quickly. Her fingers tightened around her coffee mug, her knuckles turning white. The dispatcher confirmed that officers were on their way. Margaret ended the call and took a deep breath. Now, all she had to do was wait. Her gaze stayed locked onto the house, her mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. Had he stolen the key? Was he pretending to be a resident? Was he ransacking the place right now, stuffing valuables into a duffel bag? She imagined him pocketing expensive watches, grabbing jewelry from unseen drawers, unplugging high-end electronics and slipping them into his sleek car, ready to disappear before anyone could catch him. Margaret's pulse thrummed with righteous indignation. Not in my neighborhood. And then, almost as if the universe agreed with her, she heard it. The low hum of sirens. Relief flooded through her as two police cars turned onto the street, their lights flashing but sirens kept silent, stealth mode. She straightened her posture, satisfaction blooming in her chest. Finally, someone was going to handle this. As the officers stepped out, one male, one female, Margaret took a step forward, waving them over. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," she said, gesturing toward the house. "He's inside right now. I saw him walk in as if he owns the place, but I know he doesn't live there. I've never seen him before." The male officer, his badge reading Officer Carter, gave her a professional nod. "We'll take it from here, ma'am." Margaret stepped back, arms crossed, heart thudding in anticipation. She watched as they approached the house, her mind already picturing the inevitable outcome. They would knock. He would hesitate. Maybe he would try to run. They would catch him, arrest him. They would haul him away, and Margaret would have done her duty to the neighborhood once again. But she had no idea that the reality waiting behind that door was about to shatter everything she thought she knew. The distant hum of sirens sent a wave of relief through Margaret. Finally, someone was going to take care of this. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the pristine windows of Lakeshore Estates, casting a dramatic glow across the neatly trimmed lawns and brick-paved sidewalks. Two patrol cars pulled up in front of the house, their engines humming low, sirens off but lights flashing, a sign that the officers wanted to be discreet. The sight filled Margaret with a sense of satisfaction. She had done her duty. She had protected her neighborhood. She stood on the sidewalk, waiting, watching, ready to provide her account of what she had seen. As soon as the officers stepped out, she wasted no time waving them over. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," she called, her voice breathless with urgency. Two uniformed officers, a man and a woman, approached. The male officer, Ryan Carter, looked to be in his mid-40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression. The female officer, Sofia Delgado, was younger, maybe early 30s, her dark brown hair neatly pulled back into a bun. Her face was unreadable, neutral, the way officers were trained to be when assessing a situation. Margaret was quick to speak, gesturing toward the house as she did. "I saw him unlock the door like he owned the place," she said, lowering her voice slightly. "But I know for a fact that no one like him lives here." Officer Carter raised an eyebrow, scribbling something down on a notepad. "And by no one like him, what exactly do you mean, ma'am?" Margaret faltered for just a second, but quickly recovered. "I just mean, I know everyone in this neighborhood. This house has been vacant for months. There's no way he bought it, and he was acting suspicious." Delgado gave her a quick glance, then looked toward the house. "Did you actually see him break in?" "No," Margaret admitted, "but he had a key." And how would he have a key if he didn't? Ma'am, having a key is usually a sign that someone does belong there, Delgado said, her tone level but firm. Margaret felt her face flush. But I know no one like him, no one like that. She stopped herself mid-sentence, realizing she was about to say something that might not go over well. Instead, she took a breath, lowered her voice, and tried again. I just want to make sure everything's okay. Carter gave a short nod. All right, we'll check it out. Margaret took a step back, arms crossed, as the officers walked up to the house. She expected them to knock loudly, maybe even draw their weapons just in case. But they didn't. They simply walked up, rapped on the door in a firm but polite manner, and waited. A few moments later, the front door opened, and there he was. The man, the intruder, stood in the doorway, perfectly at ease. Margaret watched closely, expecting nervousness, guilt, maybe even a failed attempt to flee. But instead, the man stood tall, relaxed, his expression unreadable but calm. He was taller than she had realized, with an air of quiet confidence. His neatly trimmed beard and sharp, well-fitted clothes made him look almost distinguished. He didn't have the jittery, shifty look of someone who knew they had been caught. If anything, he looked mildly curious. "Good morning, officers. Can I help you?" Margaret's stomach twisted. Why isn't he panicking? Officer Carter cleared his throat. "Sir, we received a report of suspicious activity at this residence. Can you confirm whether or not you live here?" The man blinked but didn't look surprised. "Of course. My name is Jonathan Hayes. I live here." Margaret's arms tightened over her chest. "No, you don't." There was a beat of silence. Officer Carter studied him, looking for signs of deceit. Delgado tilted her head slightly. "Do you have any form of identification that shows this is your residence?" "Certainly," Jonathan said smoothly. "Give me a moment." He turned and disappeared inside. Margaret felt her heart rate spike. He's trying to buy time. He's going to escape out the back. She took a few steps forward. "Officers," she called, "be careful. He could be stalling. You should—" "Ma'am," Delgado said over her shoulder, her voice calm but firm, "we've got it under control." Margaret huffed but bit her tongue. A minute later, Jonathan returned. In his hands were a driver's license, a stack of official-looking papers, and what looked like a deed. Margaret's pulse quickened. "No." He handed them to Officer Carter, who took them and flipped through the documents carefully. Delgado glanced over his shoulder, nodding as she read along. Margaret held her breath, waiting for them to call him out, waiting for the gotcha moment when they'd realize the papers were fake or that he had stolen them. Instead, Carter lifted his gaze and said the words that made her stomach drop. "Everything checks out, Mr. Hayes. Sorry for the disturbance." Jonathan gave them a small, polite smile. "No problem, officer. I figured something like this might happen when I moved in." Margaret's throat went dry. She stepped forward again, unable to stop herself. "Wait just a minute," she snapped. "That can't be right. He doesn't live here." "I've lived in this neighborhood for years. I would know." Jonathan turned to look at her for the first time, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "I don't need your permission to live here." Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. Officer Delgado exhaled quietly and looked at her partner. "I think our job here is done." Carter nodded and handed Jonathan his papers back. "Again, sorry for the trouble, sir. Have a good rest of your day." Jonathan took his documents, gave them both a small nod, then turned and stepped back inside, shutting the door behind him. The sound of the door clicking shut felt deafening to Margaret. She stared at it, her face burning, her fists clenched. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had called the police. She had reported a crime. She had done her duty as a good neighbor. But instead of being thanked, instead of being proven right, she had been dismissed. Ignored. And the man, Jonathan, he hadn't even seemed angry. If anything, he had looked like he had expected this. Like he had been through this before. Margaret's stomach twisted, something about that made her even angrier. The silence that followed Jonathan's words was thick enough to cut with a knife. Margaret stood frozen, her lips parted in stunned disbelief. The neatly trimmed lawns, the gleaming driveways, the towering oak trees lining the streets, all of it suddenly felt like it was shifting under her feet. She had been so sure. She had called the police, convinced that she was stopping a crime, that she was protecting her neighborhood. And yet, here they were, the officers standing before her, apologizing to the man she had just tried to have arrested. Jonathan Hayes wasn't a thief. He wasn't an intruder. He was the owner of the entire neighborhood. Margaret's mind struggled to process what had just happened. Only moments ago, she had been so certain of what she thought she knew. But now, watching as Officer Carter casually handed Jonathan back his documents without a trace of suspicion or hesitation, made her stomach churn. "Everything checks out, Mr. Hayes. Sorry for the misunderstanding." Jonathan accepted his papers with a slight nod, his expression calm, almost too calm, as if he had expected this exact situation to play out the way it had. Margaret, on the other hand, felt a burning heat rise up her neck. "No," she blurted out, stepping forward so quickly that her coffee sloshed over the edge of her cup. "No way, that can't be right." The officers turned their heads toward her, their expressions unreadable, but Margaret hardly noticed. She pointed a shaking finger at Jonathan. "People like him can't just buy homes here." A heavy silence fell over the street. Officer Delgado's jaw tightened slightly, and Officer Carter's polite neutrality faltered for the briefest moment. Jonathan, however, remained completely unshaken. He simply looked at Margaret, really looked at her, his dark brown eyes steady, unreadable, as if weighing her reaction. And then, after a long, deliberate pause, he spoke. "You seem very invested in this community, Miss Simmons," he said smoothly. "I can tell you take great pride in knowing every little detail about this neighborhood." Margaret felt an involuntary rush of satisfaction at that statement, but before she could say anything, Jonathan continued, "But I don't just own this house." He took a small step forward, his voice light but deliberate, each word measured. "I own all of Lakeshore Estates." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She blinked. "You what?" She felt the words leave her lips, but they didn't even sound like her own. She was certain she had misheard him, because what he was suggesting, what he was claiming, was impossible. He couldn't own Lakeshore Estates. She was the one who had been here for years. She was the one who knew the ins and outs of this community, who made sure the right people lived here, who kept the wrong ones out. There was no way, that a man like him— Jonathan tilted his head slightly, watching her reaction, and that same small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of his lips. He wasn't gloating, but he wasn't about to apologize either. Margaret felt her heartbeat in her ears. She wanted to argue, she needed to argue, but for the first time in a long time she found herself at a loss. Her hands clenched at her sides as she shook her head, stepping forward once again as if sheer proximity to him would make his words false. "You can't," she swallowed, her throat dry. "That's not possible. I've lived here for years, and I would have known if someone— Would you?" Jonathan interrupted, arching an eyebrow. His voice was polite, patient, but there was an undeniable sharpness to it. "Because I bought Lakeshore Estates 3 years ago. It was part of a larger real estate acquisition deal. The developers who originally built this neighborhood sold the entire subdivision to my firm. Since then, I've owned every property here, including," he paused, just long enough for the words to settle, "the house you live in, Miss Simmons." The air vanished from Margaret's lungs. She physically staggered back, her hand clutching her coffee cup as if it were the only thing grounding her in reality. "No." It was the only word she could manage, but Jonathan didn't need to say anything else. He had already said enough. For a long moment, no one spoke. Officer Carter glanced between the two of them before clearing his throat and straightening his uniform. "Well," he said awkwardly, shifting his weight, "I think that clears everything up." Officer Delgado exhaled quietly and gave Jonathan a small nod. "Sorry for the trouble, Mr. Hayes. We'll be on our way." Jonathan returned the nod, tucking his papers back into the slim leather folder he had brought them out in. "No problem, officer. I figured something like this might happen." Margaret's stomach turned. He had expected this, had expected someone like her to call the cops on him. The thought made her insides twist. What was he implying? That she was. Margaret's thoughts were cut off as the officers turned to leave, heading back toward their patrol cars. For them, this was just another call, a misunderstanding, nothing more. But for Margaret, everything had changed. She stood there, her skin hot with humiliation, her face burning with the realization of what had just happened. And Jonathan was still watching her. Not with anger, not with gloating, but with something worse, with pity. And Margaret hated it. Jonathan gave her a final glance before turning on his heel and walking back toward his house. His house. That was the part that made Margaret's stomach churn the most. He wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't an intruder. He wasn't a criminal. He was her neighbor. And not just that, he was the owner of the very community she had spent years thinking she was protecting. As his front door shut behind him, Margaret remained rooted to the spot. Her coffee had gone cold. Her fingers trembled. The weight of everything, the humiliation, the exposure, the truth, pressed down on her like an anvil. She had thought she was standing at the top of the hierarchy of Lakeshore estates. But today, she had learned the truth. She wasn't at the top of anything. She never had been. Margaret's breath came in short, uneven bursts, her chest tightening as if all the air had been sucked out of Lakeshore Estates itself. "Why, you're lying." Her voice was shaky, almost unrecognizable even to herself. "That's impossible." But the way Jonathan Hayes stood before her, calm, unwavering, it was clear he wasn't lying. He wasn't trying to convince her. He wasn't even trying to prove anything. Because he didn't need to. Jonathan Hayes already owned the truth, and apparently he owned everything else too. "I'm a real estate investor," he said casually, as if he were explaining something as simple as the weather. "I purchased this entire neighborhood years ago. I own multiple properties here, including—" His eyes flicked over her, that same measured, patient expression still on his face. "The house you live in." Margaret's entire body went cold. The words felt like a slap, like the world itself had tilted sideways. A thick silence hung in the air, suffocating in its weight. Officer Ryan Carter shifted uncomfortably, exchanging a quick glance with his partner, Officer Delgado. The reality of the situation had finally settled over them, and Margaret could see it in their eyes. The understanding of what had just happened, of what this really was. They had been called out for nothing. They had been summoned here because a woman, Margaret Simmons, had assumed that a black man walking into a house in her neighborhood was committing a crime, and they had treated it like a legitimate emergency. Delgado's face was unreadable, but Margaret saw the slight tension in her jaw, the way her fingers subtly curled into a fist at her side. "Apologies for the mistake, Mr. Hayes," Officer Carter finally said, clearing his throat. There was something off in his voice now, an awkwardness, a subtle hesitation, as if the weight of this moment had suddenly hit him. Jonathan, ever composed, simply nodded. "No problem," he said smoothly. "I figured something like this would happen when I moved in." It was a simple statement, but there was something else underneath it, something loaded, something that made Margaret's stomach turn. He expected this. He had been prepared for this. Had he known that someone like her would call the cops on him? Had he anticipated that his very presence would be seen as a threat? The thought made Margaret feel sick. And the worst part, she couldn't deny it. The officers didn't linger. They had no reason to. There was no crime, no reason for them to be here, and worst of all, they knew it. "Let's go," Carter muttered to Delgado, rubbing the back of his neck as he turned toward the patrol car. Margaret watched, her throat dry, as Delgado gave one final glance at Jonathan before following her partner. They both climbed into their respective vehicles, started their engines, and pulled away, the hum of their departure filling the air. The flashing red and blue lights disappeared down the street, leaving only an uncomfortable, exposed silence in their place. And Margaret was alone. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the respected neighbor or the guardian of Lakeshore Estates. She wasn't a concerned citizen who had done the right thing. She was just a woman who had been wrong, and everyone knew it. Jonathan hadn't moved. He was still standing there, looking at her with that same calm, unshaken expression. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even smug. But that was the worst part, because if he had been angry, if he had yelled or gloated, it would have been easier for Margaret to justify how she felt. She could have turned this into something else. She could have convinced herself that he was rude, disrespectful, that her suspicions had been valid. But Jonathan Hayes wasn't giving her that. He wasn't feeding her any excuses. He was simply standing there watching her, like he knew exactly what was running through her mind. Margaret swallowed hard. She should say something. She should apologize, but she couldn't, because to apologize meant to admit that she had been wrong. And Margaret Simmons had spent her entire life believing she was always right. So instead, she did what cowards do. She said nothing. She turned sharply on her heel and walked away. She didn't hear footsteps following her. Jonathan wasn't coming after her. He didn't need to. He had already won. The walk back to her house felt like the longest distance she had ever traveled, even though it was only a few doors down. With every step, she felt her humiliation sink deeper into her skin. It clung to her like an invisible weight, wrapping around her shoulders, pressing into her chest. Her neighbors had seen. Even if they weren't outside, even if they weren't standing on their lawns watching the scene unfold, they knew. They would talk. She could already hear it. "Did you hear about Margaret calling the cops on the new homeowner? I heard she insisted he was a criminal. Can you imagine? The owner of the entire neighborhood." She reached her front door and shoved it open, stepping inside and slamming it shut behind her. For the first time in her life, her own home felt foreign, because it wasn't just her home anymore. It belonged to Jonathan Hayes, and it always had. Margaret stood in the middle of her living room, staring blankly ahead. Her pristine, perfectly decorated home. The home she had lived in for years, built her life around, taken so much pride in. It wasn't really hers. The walls felt closer now. The space felt tighter. She wasn't the gatekeeper of Lakeshore Estates anymore. She was a woman who had exposed herself for what she truly was, and worst of all, she had done it to herself. As she sank onto the couch, staring numbly at the floor, one thought echoed over and over in her mind. I was wrong. But no matter how many times she repeated it, no matter how deeply she felt it, she knew there were some mistakes that people never forget. Margaret took a shaky step back, but no matter how much distance she tried to put between herself and Jonathan Hayes, she couldn't escape the truth. The very community she had spent years protecting, the neighborhood she had taken so much pride in, wasn't hers at all. It had never been. All this time, she had considered herself the gatekeeper of Lakeshore Estates, the unofficial guardian of standards, the enforcer of the right kind of order. But the man she had just tried to force out didn't just have a right to be here. He owned the entire neighborhood. And now, she wasn't sure if she belonged anymore. Jonathan was still watching her, but not with anger, not with gloating, just patience. "I understand you care about this neighborhood," he said calmly. "But next time, maybe get to know someone before jumping to conclusions." His words weren't sharp, weren't cutting, but they hit Margaret harder than if he had shouted at her. Because there was no defense against them. He wasn't telling her anything untrue. He wasn't accusing her of anything she hadn't already proven herself guilty of. Her mouth opened, maybe to respond, maybe to deny, maybe to apologize, but no words came out. There was nothing to say, nothing that could undo what she had done. So instead, she turned and walked away. Margaret had never felt small before. She had always walked with purpose, with authority, with a sense that she belonged wherever she went. But as she made her way back to her house, just a few doors down, it felt like an eternity. Her chest was tight. Her hands felt cold despite the warm sun overhead. Every step echoed in her ears. She refused to look back, but she could feel the weight of what had just happened pressing down on her like an invisible force. Jonathan didn't call after her. He didn't try to get in one last word. He didn't need to. She had already heard everything she needed to hear, and the worst part, she knew everyone else had too. When she finally reached her front door, she fumbled with her keys. Her hands trembled, not from anger, not even from embarrassment, but from something she didn't want to name. She stepped inside, shut the door behind her, and let out a slow, uneven breath. The house was silent, too silent, but not the kind of peaceful silence she had always enjoyed, the kind that came from knowing everything was as it should be. This was heavy, loud, the kind of silence that came with knowing something had changed, and it wasn't just the neighborhood, it was her. Margaret sank onto the couch, gripping the cushion like it might keep her steady. She had always felt at home here, but now she felt like a stranger in her own house, as if the walls themselves knew what she had done. In the days that followed, Margaret went out of her way to avoid Jonathan Hayes. If she saw him outside while she was getting the mail, she waited until he was gone. If she heard his car pulling into the driveway, she closed the blinds. If she spotted him walking through the neighborhood, she turned around before he could see her. She told herself it was because she was angry, that it wasn't right, that he shouldn't have spoken to her like that he shouldn't have made her feel this way. But deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't avoiding him. She was avoiding herself, because facing Jonathan meant facing the reality of what she had done. And Margaret Simmons had spent her entire life believing she was always right. This was the first time she had ever been forced to admit she was wrong. The strangest part was, nothing about Lakeshore Estates had changed. Not physically, at least. The houses were the same. The streets were the same. The people were the same. And yet Margaret felt like everything was different. She noticed it when she passed her neighbors. Some gave her tight, polite smiles, but they felt forced. Some avoided eye contact altogether, and others just stared. Not with open judgment, not with outright hostility, but with awareness. They knew. They knew what she had done. They knew she had called the police on a man who had done nothing wrong, and they knew exactly why. That was the worst part. Not that she had been wrong, not that she had humiliated herself, but that now everyone saw her for what she really was. She had spent so much time watching everyone else. Now she was the one being watched. And she hated it. For years, Margaret had been the figure in Lakeshore Estates, the gatekeeper, the one who knew everyone and everything, the one who kept the neighborhood just right, who made sure the right people lived there, and who had always believed she was protecting something. But now she wasn't the gatekeeper anymore. She was the problem. She wasn't the one ensuring order. She was the one who had disrupted it. The power she thought she had, the influence, the authority was gone, and it wasn't because of Jonathan Hayes. It wasn't even because the police had left without taking her side. It was because she had revealed herself. To everyone. To herself. She had convinced herself that she belonged here more than anyone. That she had a right to this neighborhood. That it was hers to protect. But standing on her porch days later, staring at the streets she had once walked with pride, Margaret finally understood. She wasn't the guardian of Lakeshore Estates. She wasn't the one who set the rules. She wasn't even the one who belonged here, because she hadn't been pushed out. She hadn't been forced to leave. And yet, she didn't feel like she belonged anymore. Not because anything had changed. Not because new people had moved in. Not even because Jonathan Hayes owned the very ground she stood on, but because her own prejudice had made her the one who didn't belong anymore. And for the first time in her life, she knew she deserved it.